Richard Sterling thought the divorce was already over. He had the high-priced legal team, the ironclad prenup, and the arrogance of a man who had never lost a deal in his life. When he saw his wife Kaylee walk into the courtroom without a lawyer, he actually laughed out loud. He leaned over to his associate and whispered, "This is going to be a slaughter." But the smile was wiped from his face the moment Judge Harrison took the bench. He didn't ask Kaylee where her lawyer was. Instead, he looked at her with terrified recognition and called her name. What happened next wasn't a trial. It was an execution. The air in courtroom 4B of the Superior Court of Cook County smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. It was a scent Richard Sterling loved. To him, it was the smell of victory. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit, checking the reflection of his Patek Philippe watch in the polished mahogany table. He was 45, handsome in a jagged predatory way, and currently the CEO of Sterling Halloway Holdings, one of the largest commercial real estate firms in Chicago. He was worth on paper just over $80 million, and he was about to make sure his wife Kaylee didn't get a dime of it. "She's late," Arthur Caldwell muttered, checking his own watch. Arthur was Richard's lead counsel, a man whose hourly rate could feed a family of 4 for a month. He was a shark in a pinstripe suit, known for burying opponents under mountains of paperwork until they suffocated. "Let her be late," Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Probably trying to find a parking spot for that beat-up Honda I let her keep. Or maybe she's crying in the bathroom. Honestly, Arthur, I almost feel bad for her. Almost." Richard glanced at the empty table across the aisle. It looked pathetic. Just a bare wooden surface, 2 empty chairs, and a silence that screamed defeat. "Remind me again," Arthur said, leafing through a 3-inch thick file. "Who is representing her?" The notice of appearance was blank. "That's the point," Richard grinned. "She doesn't have anyone. I froze the joint accounts 3 weeks ago. She can't afford a retainer for a decent lawyer, and she's too proud to go to legal aid. She thinks she can talk to the judge, cry a few tears about the emotional abuse, and get a payout." Richard's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "She doesn't get it. This is the big leagues. We aren't arguing over a dog or a timeshare. We are arguing over my empire, and she is walking in here with a slingshot." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. Heads turned. The court reporter looked up from her machine. The bailiff, a burly man named Officer Miller, who had seen it all, shifted his stance. Kaylee Sterling walked in. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the last month sleeping on her sister's couch, though Richard knew for a fact she had. She wore a charcoal grey dress that was simple conservative and completely unbranded. Her hair, usually worn in the loose, wavy style Richard liked, because it made her look like a trophy, was pulled back into a severe tight bun. She carried no purse, no tissues, just a single battered brown leather briefcase that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store in the 1990s. She walked down the center aisle. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at the bailiff. And most infuriatingly, she didn't look at Richard. "Look at her!" Richard snorted loud enough for the few spectators to hear. "Walking in like she owns the place. Sad." Kaylee reached the plaintiff's table. She set the briefcase down with a heavy thud. She pulled out the chair and sat placing her hands flat on the table. She was perfectly still. Arthur Caldwell, however, wasn't laughing. He frowned, squinting at Kaylee. He nudged Richard. Is that the briefcase she usually uses? What, who cares?" Richard dismissed him. "It's probably full of romance novels and tissues." No. Arthur whispered, a strange tension entering his voice. That leather, the wear pattern, it looks like an old litigation bag. Did she ever work? Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Work, Kayleigh. Please. I met her when she was a junior copy editor at a publishing house making 30 grand a year. She quit 2 weeks before the wedding. Her job for the last 10 years has been planning charity galas and spending my money. She doesn't know a tort from a tart. Just then, the door to the judge's chambers opened. All rise, Officer Miller bellowed. The Honorable Judge Anthony Harrison, presiding. The room stood. Judge Harrison was a legend in Chicago family law. He was 65, with eyebrows like steel wool, and a reputation for having absolutely zero patience for theatrics. He was known as the Butcher because he tended to cut through nonsense arguments with brutal efficiency. Richard had paid a lot of money to ensure their case landed on Harrison's docket, knowing the judge favored hard contracts and prenups over emotional pleas. Judge Harrison took his seat, arranging his robes. He put on his reading glasses and looked down at the docket. Case number 24-D-1098, Sterling versus Sterling, the judge read. His voice was gravel. He looked up his eyes, scanning the room. First, he looked at Richard's table. He nodded at Arthur. Mr. Caldwell, good to see you. And you, Your Honor, Arthur said smoothly. Then the judge looked to the left. He looked at the woman in the grey dress. Richard smirked. He waited for the question. Mrs. Sterling, where is your counsel? Mrs. Sterling, do you understand the proceedings? But the question never came. Judge Harrison froze. His hands, which had been shuffling papers, stopped mid-air. He squinted, leaning over the bench as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He took his glasses off, wiped them on his robe, and put them back on. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. It was uncomfortable. Richard shifted, confused. Why was the judge staring at his wife? Then Judge Harrison spoke. But his tone wasn't authoritative. It was stunned. Miss Devereux. Richard blinked. Devereux. That was Kayleigh's maiden name. She hadn't used it in 10 years. Kayleigh stood up slowly. Her posture changed. The submissive, quiet housewife Richard had bullied for a decade evaporated. In her place stood someone taller, colder. Good morning, Judge Harrison, Kayleigh said. Her voice was different. It was deeper, resonating from the diaphragm projected perfectly for the acoustics of the room. I am appearing on my own behalf today. And yes, for the record, I will be using my professional name, Kayleigh Devereux. The judge let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. He looked at Arthur Caldwell. He looked back at Kayleigh. Then a small, terrifying smile touched the judge's lips. I wasn't aware you had returned to the practice, Miss Devereux. I haven't, Your Honor, Kayleigh said, unbuckling the battered briefcase. Not until this morning. Richard leaned over to Arthur, panic flickering in his chest for the first time. What is he talking about? What practice? She was an editor. Arthur Caldwell had gone pale. He was staring at Kayleigh with the look of a man who realizes he has brought a knife to a nuclear war. Richard, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. You told me she was a copy editor. She was at Simon & Schuster or something. No, Arthur hissed. I think your wife is the Kayleigh Devereux. Who the hell is Kayleigh Devereux? Richard demanded. Arthur didn't answer. He just watched as Kaylee pulled a single thick document from her bag and laid it on the table. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "I have a motion to dismiss the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, racketeering, and gross concealment of assets, and I have the forensic receipts to prove it." Richard's laugh died in his throat. To understand the magnitude of the silence that fell over the courtroom, you have to understand the decade that preceded it. Richard Sterling was a man who collected things. He collected vintage Porsches. He collected commercial properties in gentrifying neighborhoods. And 10 years ago, he decided to collect a wife. He met Kaylee at a fundraiser in New York. She was 26, quiet and strikingly beautiful in an understated way. She was standing by the bar, sipping club soda, looking slightly bored. Richard approached her with the confidence of a man who owned the building they were standing in. He asked her what she did. "I'm in publishing," she had said. "I work with text, fixing mistakes." Richard heard what he wanted to hear. Publishing, text, low salary, artsy. Perfect. He didn't ask which firm. He didn't ask what kind of text. He assumed she meant novels or magazines. He wooed her with dinners at Le Bernardin, weekends in the Hamptons, and gifts of diamonds that cost more than her rent. Carly was hesitant at first. She seemed to study him, her green eyes calculating in a way he mistook for shyness. Eventually, she agreed to marry him. But there was a condition. Richard insisted on a prenup, a brutal one. "It's just business, darling," he had told her, sliding the document across the mahogany desk in his study. "My board of directors insists on it. If we divorce, you leave with what you came with. It protects us both." Kaylee had read the document. It was 50 pages long. It stipulated that if they divorced, she would receive a lump sum of $50,000 for every year of marriage, capped at $500,000. No alimony. No claim to his real estate. No claim to his future earnings. She had looked at him then, a strange expression on her face. "You really don't trust anyone, do you, Richard?" "I trust contracts." He had smiled. She signed it without asking for a lawyer to review it. Richard had bragged about that to his friends for years. She signed it blind. That's how much she loves me, or how stupid she is. For the next 10 years, Kylie played the part. She redecorated the penthouse. She hosted the dinners. She listened to Richard rant about his business rivals, nodding in all the right places. But Richard was a narcissist, and narcissists are blind to everything that doesn't reflect them. He never noticed that when he talked about complex tax loopholes, Kaylee understood them instantly. He never noticed that when he brought legal briefs home from the office, she would glance at them and point out typos that were actually critical clauses which would have exposed him to liability. He treated her like a beautiful lamp. You don't ask a lamp about its history. He didn't know that before she was in publishing, Kaylee Devereaux had graduated first in her class at Yale Law. He didn't know that she had spent 3 years at the Southern District of New York as a prosecutor, specializing in white-collar financial crimes. He didn't know that she had left the law, not because she couldn't hack it, but because she had burned out after a case where the defendant, a corrupt billionaire real estate developer, had threatened her family. She had gone into publishing legal textbooks to hide, to breathe, to live a quiet life. She had fallen in love with Richard because he seemed strong, safe, and successful. She thought she could leave the shark tank behind, but over the years she watched. She watched Richard berate waiters. She watched him cheat his contractors. She watched him hide money in shell companies in the Caymans. She watched him flirt with his assistants, and eventually she found the texts that proved he was sleeping with them. The final straw came 6 months ago. Richard had come home drunk and laughed about evicting a retirement home because he wanted to turn the building into luxury condos. "Loophole in the lease," he had bragged. "Kicked the old bats out on the street. Legal said it was tight." Kaylee had looked at him, and the love she had once felt turned into cold, hard ash. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She went to her separate bedroom, opened her laptop, and logged into the American Bar Association website to reinstate her license. Then she started digging. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from a civil hearing to a gladiatorial arena. Arthur Caldwell was frantically texting his junior associates. "Search Kaylee Devereaux. Now. Yale. SDNY. Find everything." Richard was still confused. "Arthur, stop texting and object. She can't just throw papers at the judge. Shut up, Richard." Arthur snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Judge Harrison was reading the document Kaylee had handed him. His eyebrows climbed higher and higher. "Ms. Devereaux," the judge said, looking over his glasses. This is a forensic audit of the Cayman holdings known as Blue Heron LLC." "Yes, Your Honor," Kaylee said calmly. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back. "My husband claims his net worth is $80 million. He claims Blue Heron LLC is a defunct entity with no assets. However, if you turn to page 14, you will see a wire transfer initiated 3 days before he filed for divorce." Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. Blue Heron. How did she know about Blue Heron? That was buried 3 layers deep in shell companies. The paperwork was in a safe in his office. "The transfer," Kaylee continued, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel, "was for $12 million. It was moved to a bank in Liechtenstein. The signatory on the account is not Richard Sterling. It is a man named Marcus Vance." Kaylee paused for effect. She turned her head just an inch to look at Richard. It was the first time she had acknowledged him. Her eyes were empty of warmth. "Marcus Vance," she said to the judge, "is the name of the protagonist in a novel Richard tried to write in college. He uses it as an alias for his dark money." The courtroom gasped. Even the bailiff looked surprised. "Objection." Arthur Caldwell stood up, but it was weak. "Your Honor, this is ambush litigation. We haven't seen these documents. These are alleged." "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harrison barked, "sit down. You will have your turn. But if your client hid $12 million 3 days before filing financial affidavits, I'm going to have the IRS in here so fast your head will spin." The judge turned back to Kaylee. "Ms. Devereaux, you mentioned a motion to dismiss the prenup." "Yes," Kaylee said. She walked around the table. She moved with the prowl of a predator who has cornered its prey. "The prenuptial agreement contains a standard clause regarding full and fair disclosure. It states that both parties have fully disclosed their assets. If either party lies, the agreement is void." She pointed a slender finger at the stack of papers. "Richard didn't just lie, Your Honor. He committed perjury. And because the prenup is void, we revert to Illinois state law regarding marital property." She smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Which means," she said softly, "I am entitled to 50% of everything, including the $12 million he tried to steal." Richard stood up, his face purple. "You were a secretary. You fixed commas. You don't know what you're talking about. Sit down, Mr. Sterling." The judge slammed his gavel. Kaylee turned to Richard fully now. She looked him up and down, dissecting him. "I didn't fix commas, Richard," she said, her voice dropping so only the front row could hear. "I fixed logic, and your logic has always been flawed. You thought because I was quiet, I was stupid. You thought because I was kind, I was weak. She took a step closer to his table. Arthur Caldwell actually leaned away from her. "I spent 3 years hunting men smarter than you for the Southern District of New York," she whispered. "I took down hedge fund managers who could buy and sell you before breakfast. Did you really think you could hide a paper trail from me?" Richard slumped back into his chair. He looked at Arthur. "Do something," he pleaded. Arthur looked at his phone. A text had just come through from his office. Subject Kyle Devereaux. Body legend, nicknamed the Ice Pick. Unprecedented conviction rate. Quit 10 years ago. Do not go to trial. Settle. Repeat. Settle now. Arthur closed his eyes. "Richard," he whispered, "we are screwed." But Kayleigh wasn't done. "Your Honor," she said, turning back to the bench. "The financial fraud is just the opener. I would now like to address the matter of the Sterling Tower project in downtown Chicago. Specifically, the bribes paid to city council members to get the zoning permits approved." The blood drained from Richard's face so fast he nearly fainted. That wasn't just a divorce issue. That was prison. "Ms. Devereaux," Judge Harrison said, his voice grave, "you are alleging criminal misconduct." "I am not alleging, Your Honor," Kayleigh said, reaching into her bag again. She pulled out a flash drive. "I am reporting. I have the audio recordings." The silence in the courtroom following Kayleigh's declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. Richard sat frozen, his hand halfway to his water glass. The word bribery hung in the air, radioactive. "In family court, you argue about assets custody, who gets the house in the Hamptons. You do not typically accuse the respondent of a federal felony that carries a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence." Arthur Caldwell recovered first. He shot out of his chair, his face a mask of faux outrage. "Objection, Your Honor. This is preposterous, counsel." "Excuse me." "Mrs. Sterling is trying to turn a divorce hearing into a criminal tribunal. These alleged recordings are inadmissible. Illinois is a two-party consent state. Unless she has a warrant, which she does not, any recording made without my client's knowledge is illegal and fruit of the poisonous tree." Arthur looked triumphant. He looked at Richard as if to say, "I got this." It was a solid legal argument. Kayleigh didn't even blink. She walked slowly back to her table, her heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. She picked up the flash drive and held it up to the light. "Mr. Caldwell is correct about the statute," Kayleigh said, her voice conversational, almost bored. "Illinois is indeed a two-party consent state." She turned to the judge. "However, Your Honor is well aware of the crime-fraud exception to privilege, as well as the federal statutes regarding one-party consent when the recording is made to gather evidence of a serious felony in progress specifically regarding public corruption." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "But I didn't record, Richard. I didn't have to." Richard frowned. "Then who did?" he blurted out. Kayleigh smiled. "You did, Richard. You recorded yourself." Richard's mouth fell open. What? Your dictaphone app," Kayleigh explained, addressing the stunned courtroom. "You use it to dictate memos to your secretary while you're driving or in meetings. You have it set to auto-upload to the cloud, the same cloud account we share for our family photos. The password is our anniversary, or, well, it was." She plugged the drive into the court's AV system before Arthur could stop her. "Exhibit C," Kayleigh announced. "Dated November 14th of last year. A meeting between Richard Sterling and Alderman Michael O'Leary." Static hissed through the courtroom speakers. Then Richard's voice, clear as a bell, boomed through the room. "Look, Mike, I don't care about the zoning laws. The historical designation on that building is a joke. I need it gone. I'm putting a 50-story glass needle there. What's it going to take? Another voice, deeper, rougher, unmistakably, the alderman's. Richard, the Preservation Society is all over this. It's going to be a headache. I can't just wave a wand. Richard's voice again arrogant and dismissive. Everyone has a wand, Mike. Some people just need a little gold dust to make it work. I'll wire $50,000 to your wife's consulting firm. Consulting fees. Standard practice. Just get the permit signed by Monday. There was a pause on the tape. Then the alderman's voice. Monday is fine. 50 isn't. Make it 75. Done. Kaylee hit the space bar. The audio cut off. The courtroom was dead silent. The court reporter had stopped typing, her jaw slightly slack. Officer Miller, the bailiff, was looking at Richard not as a wealthy litigant, but as a suspect. Judge Harrison took off his glasses slowly. He looked at the ceiling, then down at Richard. The look was one of profound disappointment mixed with professional obligation. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said quietly. Yes, Your Honor. Arthur's voice was a squeak. I am obligated as an officer of the court to report evidence of a felony to the state attorney's office. You understand this? Yes, Your Honor. However. There is no however. The judge slammed his hand on the bench, making everyone jump. Your client just confessed to bribing a public official on a recording he made himself in my courtroom. Richard was shaking. He wasn't just losing his money anymore. He was seeing the walls of his life closing in. He looked at Kaylee. She was organizing her papers, completely unbothered. Why? Richard whispered, his voice cracking. Why are you doing this? You could have just asked for a settlement. Kaylee stopped. She looked up. For a moment, the mask slipped. The cool, calculating prosecutor vanished, and the woman who had been hurt shone through. I tried, Richard, she said softly. Remember, 3 months ago, I asked you to go to therapy. I asked you to stop hiding money. I asked you to treat me like a partner. You told me I was hysterical and to go buy a new purse. She hardened again. You bought a war, Richard. I'm just finishing it. Arthur Caldwell leaned over to Richard. We need a recess, he hissed. Now, before she plays anything else. We need to cut a deal. Your Honor. Arthur stood up, his legs shaky. In light of this new evidence, the defense requests a 30-minute recess to confer with counsel. Judge Harrison looked at Kaylee. Ms. Devereaux. Any objections? None, Your Honor, Kaylee said. I have plenty more. I can wait. The recess was granted, but Kaylee didn't leave the courtroom. She sat at her table checking her watch. She knew exactly what was happening in the hallway. Arthur was likely screaming at Richard. Richard was likely calling his criminal defense lawyer. But Kaylee had one more card to play. The ace of spades. Because financial crimes are complex, they take years to prosecute. The bribery tape was damaging, but Richard had high-powered friends. He might wiggle out of it. He might claim the tape was doctored or entrapment or some other technicality. She needed to destroy his character so thoroughly that no judge in Illinois would ever rule in his favor. When the court reconvened, Richard looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 30 minutes. His tie was loosened. His face was gray. Your Honor. Arthur Caldwell said, his voice subdued. My client would like to discuss a settlement regarding the marital assets. I bet he would, Judge Harrison said dryly. Ms. Devereaux. I am open to a settlement, Your Honor, Kaylee said. But first there is one final matter regarding the dissipation of marital assets that speaks to the character of the respondent. Arthur groaned. Your Honor, is this necessary? We are offering— It is necessary, Cayley cut in, because it concerns where the marital funds went and who they went to. Cayley turned to the gallery. I call Jessica Thorne to the stand. Richard's head snapped up. Jessica, he gasped. The back doors opened. A young woman, no older than 25, walked in. She was wearing a modest blue suit. She looked nervous, clutching her purse tightly. It was Jessica Thorne, Richard's executive assistant for the last 4 years. The one who booked his flights, bought his wife's anniversary gifts, and managed his calendar. Richard had fired her 2 weeks ago. He had blamed her for a missing file, a file he had lost himself, and screamed at her in front of the entire office, calling her incompetent and disposable. He hadn't given her severance. He had forgotten that Jessica knew everything. Jessica took the stand. She was sworn in. She avoided looking at Richard. Miss Thorne, Cayley said, gently approaching the witness stand. You were employed by Mr. Sterling for 4 years. Is that correct? Yes, Jessica said, her voice trembling. And during that time, did you manage his personal expenses? I did. Did you ever notice any unusual recurring payments? Jessica nodded. She took a deep breath. Yes. Every month for the last 3 years, Mr. Sterling instructed me to purchase gift cards, Visa gift cards, $5,000 each month. And what did he tell you to do with them? He told me to mail them to a P.O. box in Miami, Jessica said. Did you know who the recipient was? He told me it was for a consultant, Jessica said. But I got curious. One time I tracked the package. And it went to an apartment complex. The recipient signed for it as Elena Ricci. A murmur went through the courtroom. Cayley walked back to her table and picked up a photo. Your Honor, I am submitting a photo into evidence. This is Elena Ricci. She held up a picture of a stunning woman in a bikini on a yacht. The same yacht Richard had claimed he was on for a business retreat last summer. Ms. Thorne, Cayley continued, did Mr. Sterling ever mention Elena Ricci to you? Yes, Jessica whispered. When he had too much to drink at the office. He told me she was his real life. He told me that his wife, that you were just the banker. Cayley felt a sting in her chest, but she didn't show it. She kept her face like stone. He called me the banker. Yes, Jessica said, tearing up. He said you were boring, that he only stayed married to you because it looked good for the investors. He said he was going to leave you as soon as the Sterling Tower deal went through. He was going to move to Miami with Elena. Richard had his head in his hands. He couldn't even look at the judge. Thank you, Jessica, Cayley said. No further questions. Arthur Caldwell didn't even cross-examine. There was no point. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was nuked. Judge Harrison looked at Richard with pure disgust. In family court, judges see affairs all the time. But the calculated nature of this, the gift cards to hide the trail, the cruelty of the comments, the planned abandonment, it struck a nerve. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, I have heard enough. The silence that followed Jessica Thorne's testimony wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight pressing down on the mahogany tables, the leather chairs, and the frantic beating heart of Richard Sterling. For the first time in his adult life, Richard felt the terrifying sensation of losing control. He was a man who engineered his reality. He built skyscrapers where there were once empty lots. He moved millions of dollars across borders with a keystroke. He treated people like chess pieces, pawns to be sacrificed, knights to be maneuvered, queens to be conquered. But as he looked at the empty witness stand where his former assistant had just dismantled his character, he realized he wasn't the chess master anymore. He was the board, and Kayleigh was flipping him over. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. "Counsel," the judge said, his voice stripped of all patience. He looked over his spectacles at Arthur Caldwell, who was currently trying to make himself as small as physically possible. "I'm going to call a 30-minute recess. I strongly suggest, no, I order you to take this time to confer with your client. If you come back into this courtroom without a settlement agreement that satisfies Ms. Devereaux, I will not only issue a ruling that strips Mr. Sterling of his assets, but I will personally walk the transcript of this hearing over to the federal prosecutor's office myself." "We understand, Your Honor," Arthur squeaked. 30 minutes, the judge warned. "Do not waste them." The gavel banged. Richard stood up his legs, feeling like they were made of lead. He grabbed his file, his hands shaking so violently he dropped a gold-plated pen. It rolled across the floor, coming to a stop near Kayleigh's shoe. She didn't kick it away. She didn't pick it up. She just stepped over it, turned and walked out the double doors without a backward glance. "Richard, let's go," Arthur hissed, grabbing Richard's elbow. "We need to talk, now." They spilled out into the wide marble corridor of the courthouse. It was a cold, sterile space, high ceilings, echoing footsteps, and the indifference of strangers passing by. Lawyers in cheap suits argued on benches. A woman was crying near the elevators. A janitor was buffing the floor. Richard pulled his arm away from Arthur. "Get off me. Don't you dare take that tone with me." Arthur snapped, his own panic finally breaking through his professional veneer. "Do you have any idea what just happened in there?" "Jessica didn't just expose an affair, Richard. She exposed a pattern of financial deception that dates back 3 years. That's tax fraud. That's wire fraud. That's money laundering." "I pay you to fix this," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Heads turned. Richard didn't care. "Fix it. File a motion to strike her testimony. She's a disgruntled employee. It's hearsay." "It's not hearsay when she has the receipts," Arthur whispered furiously. "And it's not just the money. It's the tapes, Richard. The bribery. You are radioactive. I need to call my firm's ethics board just to ask if I can still represent you without getting disbarred." Arthur pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. "I'm going to find a quiet corner to call the Criminal Defense Division. You stay here. Do not speak to anyone. Do not, and I cannot stress this enough, do not speak to your wife." Arthur hurried down the hall, vanishing around a corner, leaving Richard alone. Richard leaned against the cold marble wall, loosening his silk tie. He felt like he was suffocating. He needed water. He needed a drink. He needed to wake up from this nightmare. He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward the water fountain, near the large atrium window, and there she was. Kayleigh was standing by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city Richard claimed to own. She was perfectly still, her profile sharp and elegant against the grey light of the afternoon. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't pacing. She was just waiting. A surge of irrational, hot anger flooded Richard's chest. How dared she be so calm? How dared she stand there looking like a statue of justice while his life burned to ash? He forgot Arthur's warning. He forgot the judge's threat. He walked straight toward her. "Kayleigh." She didn't jump. She didn't turn quickly. She turned her head slowly, her movement fluid and deliberate. When her eyes met his, Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Her eyes were green, but they were flat. Devoid of the warmth, the adoration or even the fear he was used to seeing. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was steady, resonant. It was the voice of a stranger. "Are you happy?" Richard demanded, stepping into her personal space. He wanted to intimidate her, to remind her of the dynamic that had ruled their marriage for a decade. "Is this what you wanted? To humiliate me publicly? To drag my name through the mud so you can get a better payout?" Kaylee turned her body fully toward him. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but with an air of appraisal. "I didn't drag your name through the mud, Richard," she replied. "You jumped in the mud yourself. I just turned on the floodlights so everyone could see you swimming in it." "This is about the money, isn't it?" Richard sneered, reaching for his wallet, a reflexive gesture of a man who thought everything had a price tag. "You want the penthouse, fine. Take it. You want the Hamptons house, it's yours. I'll sign the papers right now. Just tell the judge you made a mistake about the tapes. Tell him you want to withdraw the evidence." Kaylee watched him, a faint, pitying smile touching her lips. "You really think this is a negotiation?" "Everything is a negotiation," Richard barked. "I'm offering you $10 million in assets, Carly. That's more than you'd ever see in 10 lifetimes of editing typos for paperback novels." Kaylee laughed. It was a soft, dry sound. "There it is again. The arrogance. You still think I'm the girl you picked up at that fundraiser. You think I'm the fixer of commas." She took a step closer to him. For the first time, Richard realized she was wearing heels that made her almost eye level with him. Or maybe he was just shrinking. "I don't want your money, Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I have my own. My grandmother left me a trust that I invested in tech startups in 2008. I have more liquidity in my personal checking account than your entire company has in its operating budget." Richard blinked, stunned. "What?" "That's impossible. You used a debit card for groceries. You drove a Honda." "I drove a Honda because I didn't need a Porsche to feel important," she cut him off. "And I used your money for groceries because that was the role you wanted me to play. The dependent little wife. The trophy." She leaned in her eyes, locking onto his. "I played the part, Richard. I played it perfectly. I let you interrupt me at dinner parties. I let you explain things to me that I already knew. I let you feel big. And do you know why?" "Why?" Richard whispered, mesmerized by the intensity of her hatred. "Because I loved you," she said simply. "God help me. I actually loved you. I thought your arrogance was ambition. I thought your cruelty was just stress. I thought if I loved you enough, if I was patient enough, the man I saw glimpses of, the charming, brilliant man, would eventually stay." Her expression hardened. The mask of the ice-pick prosecutor slammed back into place. "But then you started getting sloppy. The affairs. The verbal abuse. That night you threw a wine glass at the wall because I asked you how your day was. That was the crack in the foundation. I was drunk," Richard stammered. "I didn't mean it." "Intent is irrelevant," Kaylee recited, as if quoting a statute. "The act is what matters, but the final straw, it wasn't the violence, it was the boredom." "Boredom?" "You got bored with me," Kaylee said, "and you made the fatal mistake of saying it out loud to Jessica. You called me a banker. You said I was a placeholder until the Sterling Tower deal closed." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. I was just venting. It was locker room talk." "No." Kaylee shook her head. "It was a confession. You revealed that our entire marriage was a transaction to you. And if there is one thing I learned at the Southern District of New York, Richard, it's that when you find a fraudulent transaction, you don't just cancel it." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. You prosecute it. You dismantle the organization. You seize the assets. You bury the perpetrators so deep they never see the sun again. Richard backed away, hitting the window ledge. He looked at this woman, his wife, and saw a stranger, a predator. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had been sleeping next to a loaded gun for 10 years, and he had just pulled the trigger. "You're a monster," he breathed. "I'm a mirror, Richard," she corrected him. "I just reflected you back at yourself. If you don't like what you see, don't blame the glass." "I'll fight you," Richard said, though his voice lacked any conviction. "I'll hire the best criminal defense team in the country. I'll bury you in appeals. I'll make sure you never see a dime." "With what money?" Kaylee asked calmly. "You have nothing," she interrupted. "While you were in there listening to Jessica, I had a courier deliver a temporary restraining order to your CFO. Your accounts are frozen, Richard. All of them, even the one in Liechtenstein. Did you really think Marcus Vance was a clever alias? I traced that IP address 6 months ago." Richard felt his knees give way. He slumped against the window. It was over. It was actually, truly over. The empire he had built on bullying and bribes had been dismantled by the woman he had ignored over breakfast for a decade. Suddenly, the sound of running footsteps broke the tension. Arthur Caldwell came sprinting down the hallway. His tie was flapping over his shoulder. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. He wasn't walking with the dignity of a senior partner. He was running like a man fleeing a burning building. "Richard!" Arthur gasped, skidding to a halt. He bent over, hands on his knees, wheezing. "What?" Richard snapped, looking at his lawyer with disdain. "Did you fix it?" Arthur looked up. His eyes were wide with genuine terror. "Fix it, Richard. There is no fixing this. I just got off the phone with my contact at the district attorney's office." Arthur swallowed hard, looking from Richard to Kaylee, and back again. "They aren't just investigating," Arthur whispered. "The warrant was signed an hour ago. The police are in the lobby. They're coming up the elevators right now." Richard froze. "Police here now." "They have the bribery tapes," Arthur said, his voice rising in hysteria. "They have the wire transfer records Kaylee submitted. They're charging you with RICO violations, Richard. Racketeering, bribery, wire fraud. They're talking about a 20-year minimum." Arthur straightened up, backing away from Richard. "I'm recusing myself. I can't be seen with you when the cuffs go on." "I'm sorry." Arthur turned and walked away fast. He didn't run, but he walked with a speed that screamed of self-preservation. Richard stood alone in the hallway. He looked at the elevator bank at the far end of the corridor. The lights above the doors were dinging. Up, up, up. He looked at Kaylee. For a second, he thought he might beg. He thought he might fall to his knees and grab her hand and plead for mercy. But Kaylee's face was a fortress. There was no drawbridge. There was no entry. "Run," she said. It wasn't a command. It was an observation. "Run, Richard. It won't matter. You can't outrun a forensic audit. But you can try." The elevator dinged. The doors began to slide open. Richard didn't wait to see who was inside. Panic, raw and animalistic, hijacked his brain. He turned and bolted. He ran toward the fire exit stairs at the opposite end of the hall, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the polished floor. He burst through the emergency doors, the alarm shrieking into the quiet hallway. A piercing wail that sounded like the death scream of his career. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the alarm. Silence returned to the hallway. Kaylee stood there for a long moment. She smoothed the lapel of her grey blazer. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of floor wax and old paper. It smelled like victory. She checked her watch. The recess was almost over. She turned and walked back toward courtroom 4B. She walked slowly, deliberately. She didn't need to run. She had nowhere to hide. As she reached the double doors, she paused. She caught her reflection in the glass. She looked tired. There were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. But her shoulders were back. Her head was high. She pushed the doors open and walked back into the arena alone, but no longer lonely. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind Kaylee as she walked back to the plaintiff's table. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a crater after the bomb has gone off. Arthur Caldwell sat at the defense table alone. He was packing his briefcase with the lethargic movements of a defeated man. His client, the great Richard Sterling, was gone. Judge Harrison re-entered from his chambers. He took his seat, adjusted his robes, and looked at the empty chair next to Arthur. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge rumbled, "where is your client?" Arthur stood up. He looked tired. "Your Honor, Mr. Sterling has excused himself. He has been advised to seek immediate counsel regarding the impending criminal investigation by the State Attorney's Office. He is currently unavailable." "Unavailable?" Judge Harrison repeated, a dry smile touching his lips. "I imagine in custody will be the term used shortly." The judge turned his gaze to Kaylee. "Ms. Devereaux," he said, his tone shifting to one of profound respect. "In light of the evidence presented specifically, the proof of perjury, fraud, concealment of assets, and the admission of bribery, I am prepared to issue a summary ruling. I do not believe a trial is necessary." "I agree, Your Honor," Kaylee said, standing tall. "The court finds the prenuptial agreement void ab initio due to fraudulent inducement," the judge declared, his voice booming for the record. "Furthermore, due to the respondent's dissipation of marital assets for illicit purposes and his abandonment of these proceedings, I am granting the petitioner's request in full." The judge picked up his pen. "The entirety of the marital estate, including the penthouse, the Hamptons property, and the contents of the hidden Blue Heron accounts, is awarded to Ms. Devereaux. The Sterling Tower project is frozen pending federal investigation." Arthur Caldwell didn't even object. He just nodded. "One last thing," Judge Harrison said, setting down his pen. He took off his glasses and looked directly at Kaylee. "I remember the ice pick prosecutor from 10 years ago. You were formidable then. But I must say, you are even more terrifying when you are fighting for yourself." Kaylee allowed herself a genuine smile. It reached her eyes this time. "Thank you, Your Honor. I had a lot of time to prepare." "Clearly," the judge chuckled. "Court is adjourned." The gavel banged, a sharp, final sound. Kaylee gathered her files. She clicked the locks on her battered briefcase, the briefcase that had held the secrets to her freedom. As she walked toward the exit, Arthur Caldwell stepped into the aisle. He hesitated, then looked at her. "Ms. Devereaux," he said awkwardly. I didn't know. If I had known who you were, I would have told him to settle on day one." "I know Arthur," Kaylee said softly. "That's why I didn't tell you." She walked past him, pushing open the double doors. Outside the hallway was chaotic. Reporters had already gathered, tipped off by the sudden presence of police cars outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as Kaylee emerged. They shouted questions. "Mrs. Sterling, is it true your husband was arrested?" Kayleigh, did you know about the bribes? What happens to the company? Kayleigh paused on the top step of the courthouse. The wind caught stray strands of her hair. She looked at the cameras, her expression calm, composed, and utterly powerful. "My name," she said, her voice clear enough to be heard over the shutter clicks, "is Kayleigh Devereux. And I have no comment other than this. The truth always has a way of coming out. Sometimes it just needs a little help." She walked down the steps past the chaos and hailed a cab. She didn't look back. 1 year later. The office smelled of fresh paint and lilies. It was a small space in a brownstone in Lincoln Park, far away from the glass and steel skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. On the frosted glass of the front door, etched in simple black letters, were the words, "Devereux and Associates Financial Advocacy and Family Law." Kayleigh sat behind her desk, reviewing a file. She looked different. The severity of the bun was gone, replaced by a loose, comfortable style. She wore a bright blazer, not the drab grey she had worn to court. Across from her sat a young woman. Her name was Maria. She was crying, twisting a tissue in her hands. "I don't know what to do," Maria sobbed. "He says I'm crazy. He says he has all the money, and if I leave, he'll take the kids. He says I'm just a stay-at-home mum, and no one will listen to me." Kayleigh put down her pen. She stood up, walked around the desk, and sat in the chair next to Maria. "Maria, look at me," Kayleigh said gently. The young woman looked up, her eyes red and frightened. "He is banking on your fear," Kayleigh said. "He thinks because you are quiet, you are weak. He thinks because he controls the bank accounts, he controls you." Kayleigh reached over and picked up a file from her desk. It was thick. "But we are going to change the rules of the game," Kayleigh said, a spark of the old ice pick flashing in her eyes. "You aren't just a stay-at-home mum. You are the CEO of that household. You know where the receipts are. You know his schedule. You know his passwords." I do," Maria whispered. "Good," Kayleigh smiled. "Then we have everything we need. He wants a war. We'll give him a revolution." Kayleigh's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. Breaking. Richard Sterling sentenced to 12 years for racketeering and bribery. Kayleigh swiped the notification away without opening it. She didn't need to read it. That was an old story. She was busy writing a new one. She turned back to her client. "Now," Kayleigh said, opening a fresh legal pad. "Tell me everything. Start with the day you stopped trusting him." And that is the story of how Richard Sterling learned the hardest lesson of his life: never mistake silence for weakness. He thought he was fighting a helpless housewife, but he was actually stepping into the ring with a heavyweight champion who had been training for 10 years. It's a powerful reminder that in relationships and in life, the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. Kayleigh didn't just win her freedom, she reclaimed her identity. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma, revenge, and the truth coming out, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. What would you have done if you were in Kayleigh's shoes? Would you have settled, or would you have taken him down? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.